Imagine Rome in the 1st century, a city of greatness and power, where the Roman Empire was expanding ever further, conquering far-flung lands. But behind its imposing facade lay a web of intrigue, betrayal, and power struggles. In the midst of it all, a 16-year-old boy was about to become the new emperor of Rome, changing the course of history forever. That young man was Nero, and his rise to the throne was not just a matter of inheritance, but also of manipulation, betrayal, and, of course, a destiny shaped by those around him. Before we continue this intriguing story, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, like us, and comment and share this video with your friends. This is very important to us. Nero was the son of Agrippina, an ambitious and cunning woman who wanted more than anything to see her son on the throne. Agrippina had been married to Emperor Claudius, and her marriage was a shrewd political move. Claudius, however, had other children and other legitimate heirs, but Agrippina's ambition knew no bounds. She manipulated and maneuvered the political forces until, when Claudius died, her son Nero was named as his successor. But few knew that Nero's rise to power was not an easy victory. There was tension in the air, a silent battle for control of the empire. Agrippina, with her political cunning, wanted to ensure that power remained in her hands, through her son. However, even with all this manipulation, Nero seemed to be the ideal heir. He had the bloodline of Claudius and the support of the Roman legions. And when the time finally came, he assumed the throne with the help of his mother and other important allies. But this would be only the beginning of a journey full of controversial decisions and betrayals that would shape the destiny of Rome and Nero himself. At first, Nero's image was promising. He was young, charismatic, and seemed to have what it took to rule a vast and powerful empire. The Senate and the military welcomed him with hope, believing that he could usher in a new era of prosperity for Rome. But like many other leaders, power quickly began to change Nero. He came under the influence of his mother and her advisors, who had their own plans for the empire. At first, all seemed well, but the seeds of an empire that would become known for its decline were already being planted. The young Nero was crowned emperor with the support of many, but soon the pressure to hold on to power began to take hold. There were those who wanted to see his downfall, those who doubted his ability to rule, and who would be willing to do whatever it took to ensure that the empire continued to prosper under Nero's leadership. That was a question that only time would answer. At the beginning of his reign, Nero was not only a young emperor with great aspirations, but also a tool in the hands of his mother, Agrippina, an extremely ambitious and cunning woman. Agrippina knew that in order to maintain her own position of power, she needed to ensure that her son not only ascended the throne, but that it remained there solidly and unshakably. She was one of the most influential figures in Rome, and from behind the scenes of power, she manipulated Roman politics in Nero's favor. Agrippina was the wife of Emperor Claudius, but her ambition went beyond the confines of marriage. After Claudius's death, some rumors suggested that Agrippina had poisoned her husband to ensure that her son Nero, from a previous marriage, would be named his successor. Although the exact cause of Claudius's death has never been proven, the fact remains that his death paved the way for Nero to ascend the throne. But Agrippina did not stop there. She knew that her son needed the unwavering support of the senators and the Praetorian Guard to remain in power. In the early years of her reign, Agrippina was practically the true ruler of Rome. Acting as a tireless advisor to Nero, she did not hesitate to get involved in the most intricate details of the administration of the empire, imposing her decisions and ensuring that her son's allies retained their positions of trust. During this phase, Nero was just a puppet, a young and promising face, but the real brains behind the empire was his mother. She was also not afraid to take drastic measures to ensure that nothing threatened Nero's power. Her authority within the government expanded, but her manipulation did not go unnoticed. The initially close and cooperative relationship between mother and son began to fray as Nero matured and desired to rule on his own. He began to feel that his mother was suffocating him, controlling every aspect of his political and private life. The growing tension between the two would soon become one of the major turning points in his history. Agrippina's impact was crucial to the stabilization of Nero's early reign. Had she not wielded such power and influence, the young emperor may not have been able to consolidate his control over Rome as effectively. Agrippina did everything she could to ensure that her son had a solid power base. But over time, their relationship would become increasingly contentious, leading to one of the most famous betrayals in Roman history. When Nero finally realized that he needed to free himself from his mother's influence, he did not hesitate to make a fatal decision. Agrippina was assassinated in 59 AD on the orders of her son. Although many details about Agrippina's death are still controversial, it is widely accepted that Nero, fearing his mother's excessive control over the empire, decided to eliminate her in order to rule more autonomously. This act of treason marked one of Nero's first major cruel and immoral decisions, and Agrippina's death would be only the beginning of his moral and political decline. The murder of his mother was not only a turning point in his family relationship, but also a turning point for Nero. From that moment on, he would attempt to rule alone, but his choices would become increasingly questionable and would eventually lead the empire to decline. Agrippina's impact, although decisive in his rise, was now beginning to fade, and Nero's true nature began to emerge more clearly. In 64 AD, tragedy struck the city of Rome. A great fire that lasted 6 days consumed large parts of the capital of the Roman Empire, destroying vast areas and leaving thousands of Romans homeless. The flames devastated several districts of the city, destroying temples, markets, and palaces, leaving a deep mark on the history of Rome. But for Nero, the fire was not just a natural disaster, it became a controversial landmark that would forever change the way his figure would be viewed by the Romans. The first suspicions that Nero had somehow caused the fire began to emerge soon after the tragedy. Some rumors indicated that Nero had deliberately ordered the city to be set on fire to clear space to build a new palace, the Domus Aurea, a luxurious complex he planned to build after the disaster. It is said that while Rome was burning, Nero was in his private villa, playing the lyre and singing about the fall of Troy, a fact that was widely reported by his detractors. This image of a harsh emperor who was distant from the suffering of his people contributed to a smear campaign against Nero, and the accusation that he was behind the fire quickly spread. However, the official version of the story, defended by Nero, is that he had no direct involvement in the fire, and that, on the contrary, he acted quickly to combat the flames. Nero initiated relief efforts for those affected, distributing food and shelter to the homeless and offering financial aid for reconstruction. He also decreed that the city be rebuilt with safer materials such as brick and stone to prevent further disasters. These actions, although seen as positive by many, did not prevent the growing popular suspicion that Nero had something to do with the fire. The accusation that Nero had started the fire was reinforced by the fact that many political opponents and members of the Roman elite viewed the emperor with increasing contempt. His eccentric attitudes, his departure from Roman traditions, and his growing obsession with luxury and entertainment made him an increasingly unpopular figure. Suspicions began to develop into a quasi-official narrative that Nero was responsible for destroying Rome in order to build his own masterpiece. Furthermore, the emperor, trying to divert attention from the accusation that he had started the fire, pointed to Christians as the ones to blame for the disaster. This decision resulted in the first great persecution of Christians, who were used as scapegoats to calm the population and divert the emperor's anger. Many Christians were tortured, crucified, and killed in cruel ways, and were used as public entertainment during the games and parties that Nero held. He accused them of causing the fire because of their religious practices, which were seen as subversive by the Roman elite. Despite his attempts to manipulate the narrative, the fire of Rome marked a turning point in Nero's reputation. He went from being a popular ruler, with widespread support at the outset, to a suspicious and cruel emperor in the eyes of many Romans. His name became associated with inefficiency, decadence, and despair. The fire in many ways was a symbol of what would become the decline of Nero and the Roman Empire. However, despite the destruction, Rome rose again, and under Nero's leadership, the city was rebuilt. However, the reconstruction was seen by many as an attempt by Nero to reinvent himself after the enormous tragedy and the heavy accusations against him. The Great Fire and the way Nero dealt with its aftermath helped to cement his image as a tyrannical emperor rather than a benevolent leader. This event generated controversy that would echo for many years, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of Rome. As Nero tried to control the narrative, the damage to his image among the population and the nobility only increased, and the path to his downfall began to become increasingly clear. As Nero's reign progressed, he began to be known for his eccentric actions and unpredictable behavior. His reputation as a ruler began to be marked by a series of surprising and extravagant acts, which led many to call him the Mad Caesar. What seemed to be vigorous leadership in the early years of his rule soon turned into a series of ill-considered decisions that negatively impacted Nero's image. One of Nero's greatest traits was his love of the stage. Unlike previous emperors who preferred to rule from behind the scenes, Nero saw himself as a great entertainer. He was not only a ruler, but also aspired to be a singer, poet, and actor. Nero often organized public events, such as music competitions and theatrical performances, in which he himself performed. He even performed on stage, singing and playing the lyre, in an attempt to win the public's favor. This was shocking behavior to many Romans, who viewed the emperor as someone who should be an authority figure, not an entertainer or showman. This quest for recognition in the world of the arts led to scandals in Rome. Many saw it as unworthy of an emperor who, instead of focusing on the affairs of the empire, preferred to be applauded as a performer for the nobility and senators. This was a humiliation, since an emperor should act with dignity, respecting Roman customs and traditions. However, Nero, increasingly obsessed with public adoration, did not care about the criticism, and this only increased his image as a madman in the eyes of those who did not share his love of fame and spectacle. Nero was also noted for his personal and political decadence. He began to engage in practices that were seen as completely incompatible with imperial dignity, such as extravagant parties and banquets, where excessive indulgence was the norm. These parties were often filled with luxury and excess, where Nero and his guests indulged in pleasure and opulence, while the Roman people for the most part suffered hardship. To many, this seemed to be a clear sign of moral decay and corruption, and the image of Nero as an uncontrolled and selfish emperor began to take shape. Along with his artistic and indulgent behavior, Nero also showed signs of increasing folly and cruelty. He began to make political decisions that shocked the empire. His public executions and persecutions of those he considered enemies increased, leading to a scenario of instability. The emperor did not hesitate to use violence as a means of eliminating any threat to his power, demonstrating the dark side of his personality. Nero not only departed from the dignity expected of an emperor, but also seemed to enjoy the macabre and cruel spectacles. He was, in fact, a contradictory emperor. While he saw himself as a great artist, he also became increasingly tyrannical and paranoid. He had no problem eliminating members of his own family, including his mother Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and many others who were close to him. This did nothing more than reinforce the image of Nero as a ruler incapable of discerning between personal pleasure and the responsibilities of the empire. This extravagant and cruel behavior cemented Nero's reputation as a mad emperor, a stigma that would follow him until the end of his reign. For many Romans, his obsession with fame, coupled with his contempt for traditional authority and his foolish actions, made him an increasingly unpopular emperor. It was no longer just a matter of governance. Now he was seen as a figure of mockery and danger, and his leadership began to be rejected by both the nobility and the people. As Nero tried to please his audience at his public appearances, the political reality of Rome became increasingly difficult to manage. The sham of his rule became more apparent, and the empire he had inherited as a power began to disintegrate under the weight of his poor choices. The Great Fire of Rome, which devastated the city in 64 AD, was one of the most traumatic events in the empire's history. However, what happened after the fire was even darker. With the city in ruins and the Roman people searching for answers, a narrative of blame needed to be created. And who better to blame for a disaster of such magnitude than a growing and mysterious group of people who were already viewed with suspicion? The Christians. Nero, desperate to divert attention from the growing hostility toward his leadership, turned the blame on the Christian movement, a religion that was marginalized and persecuted by many Romans because of its unconventional customs. Christians were seen as a threat to the Roman order, especially because they refused to worship traditional gods and the emperor himself, who was considered divine. This refusal to worship the emperor was considered subversive, something that could undermine the authority of the state itself. Scapegoated Christians, accusing them of having caused the burning of Rome. He orchestrated a brutal persecution of Christians, marking the beginning of the great Roman persecutions of Christians. This period was known for its extreme cruelty and violence. and Christians were captured, tortured, and executed in grotesque ways. Executions were public spectacles, used to entertain the Roman people. Nero, in his quest for popularity, spared no effort to create an atmosphere of terror and entertainment around the killings. Christians were crucified, burned alive, or thrown into the arena to be devoured by wild animals. On some occasions, Nero ordered Christians to be used as human torches, set on fire to illuminate his gardens at night. The empire, which had once recognized the importance of peace and order within its borders, was now consumed by a cycle of violence and macabre spectacle. For many Romans, these executions became a symbol not only of Nero's fury, but also of the growing religious division that was gripping the empire. While some saw the Christians as a threat, others began to question the legitimacy of Nero's actions. Scapegoating is never a lasting solution to an empire's problems, and Nero's actions only strengthened animosity toward him, further increasing distrust of his leadership. These mass murders marked the beginning of a long and tragic history of Christian persecution that would continue for centuries. But for Nero, these killings were just another way to try to bolster his image and divert attention from his own failures. What he didn't know, however, was that this violent persecution would have the opposite effect. Rather than destroying the Christian movement, the executions served to strengthen the faith of the Christians, which would eventually spread throughout the empire and become one of the most influential religions in history. These actions by Nero only served to further his reputation as a cruel and callous emperor, willing to use any means to preserve his power, regardless of the suffering it caused his people. Nero's image as an uncontrolled and tyrannical ruler was becoming stronger, and the very morality of his empire was being questioned. The relationship between Nero and his mother, Agrippina, which had been a key pillar of his rise to the throne, began to deteriorate dramatically. At the beginning of his reign, Nero was completely dependent on his mother, who had manipulated him politically, securing his appointment as emperor and controlling government decisions in the early years of his rule. However, as Nero matured and gained more confidence, he became increasingly impatient with Agrippina's control over his life and empire. Agrippina, with her manipulative nature and insatiable desire for power, was not only a protective mother, but also an ambitious politician. She not only wanted to see her son on the throne, but also to control the empire through him. In the early years of her reign, she was practically the ruler of Rome, with Nero merely following her orders. However, as time went on, Nero began to rebel against his mother's domination of his actions. He wanted to be seen as a ruler in his own right, no longer a puppet in the hands of Agrippina. The tension between mother and son culminated in one of the cruelest and most treacherous decisions in Roman history: the assassination of Agrippina. Nero, feeling threatened by his mother's power and wanting to rule without restrictions, orchestrated her death. There are several versions of how this happened, but the most widely accepted version is that Nero tried to kill her discreetly. He initially had a vessel prepared with a mechanism that appeared to be an attempt to sink the ship Agrippina was traveling on. When the attempt failed and she escaped the crash, Nero, furious, decided that a more direct approach was necessary. Finally, Nero had Agrippina killed in her residence. He had her murdered in a brutal manner, with bodyguards and Roman officials involved in the crime. Agrippina's murder was not only an act of revenge by a rebellious son, but also a clear attempt to break with his mother's legacy and take total control of the empire. By having Agrippina killed, Nero eliminated the last great source of power in his life, but it also plunged him into a spiral of guilt, paranoia, and distrust. The assassination of Agrippina was a turning point in Nero's reign. He had already begun to be seen as an eccentric and irresponsible emperor, but now his image became even darker. The way he treated his mother, one of the most powerful figures in Rome, left the Roman elite in shock. Nero was not only an immature emperor, but someone willing to destroy those closest to him in order to maintain power. Agrippina's death also had serious political consequences. Many of Agrippina's allies, who had once enjoyed Nero's full support, began to question her loyalty and ability to rule. The Roman court became unstable, with many powerful figures fearing for their lives, as the emperor now seemed unpredictable and capable of doing anything to maintain power. Furthermore, the grief and anger of many Romans, especially the aristocratic class and nobility, only increased hostility towards Nero, further aggravating the political isolation he was beginning to face. This assassination was the beginning of an even more turbulent and cruel period for Nero. From then on, he was known not only for his lack of control over the empire, but also for his tendency to eliminate anyone who was considered an obstacle to his reign, whether by treason or suspicion of treason. Agrippina's death was not just an isolated event, but part of a growing loss of moral and political control by Nero, which would soon lead to other equally questionable and cruel decisions. In AD 60, during the reign of Nero, one of the most dramatic and bloody revolts against Roman rule took place in Britannia, the island that the Romans had recently conquered. The revolt was led by Boudica, the queen of the Celtic Iceni tribe, who became one of the greatest symbols of resistance against the empire. Her struggle against the Romans, although unsuccessful, had a profound impact on the way Rome dealt with its provinces and on perceptions of Nero's rule. Boudica was not just a queen, but a woman determined to avenge the humiliation and abuse that she and her tribe had suffered under Roman rule. The trigger for the revolt was a series of Roman abuses against the Iceni. When Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, died, he had made a deal with the Romans, leaving his kingdom divided between his daughters and the Roman emperor. However, when Nero took control, the Romans not only disregarded the deal, but also plundered Boudica's lands and subjected her to public humiliation. Boudica was flogged, and her children were brutally treated. This violence and humiliation were enough to prompt Boudica to take a bold step. She united several Celtic tribes in revolt, and her leadership galvanized a large army, which marched on the Roman cities. The impact was immediate and devastating. The colony of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, one of the earliest and largest Roman colonies in Britain, was the first to be attacked. The city was completely destroyed and its inhabitants massacred. This was only the beginning of Boudica's rampage. After conquering Camulodunum, Boudica's army moved on to Londinium, modern London, which was becoming an important trading center for the Romans on the island. Boudica, with her growing force, managed to take London, and the city was ruined in a massacre, with the local population being exterminated. The Romans were in a panic, and many areas of Britain were now under the control of Boudica, who seemed to be in the best position to overthrow Roman rule. However, the Roman Empire was not easy to defeat, and despite Boudica's fury and skill, the revolt could not last forever. When the Roman forces, commanded by Suetonius Paulinus, the governor of Britain, finally gathered, the final confrontation took place. Boudica's troops faced a much better trained and equipped Roman force, and the ensuing battle was disastrous for the Celts. Boudica and her army were defeated in a decisive battle, and she, along with her followers, was forced to flee. After her defeat, Boudica disappears from history. Some accounts claim that she committed suicide to avoid capture, while others suggest that she died of illness. However, even after her death, the impact of Boudica's revolt echoed through generations. The Celtiberian rebellion served as a great lesson for the Romans, who from that moment on became more cautious in the way they governed their provinces. In Rome, Emperor Nero, who was initially oblivious to the chaos caused by the revolt, was deeply shaken by the magnitude of the resistance he faced. Boudica's revolt was a clear sign that Roman control over Britain was more fragile than previously thought, and although the revolt was eventually crushed, Boudica's resistance became a legend of courage and struggle. Her story, far from being a simple defeat, inspired many future generations to fight for freedom against tyranny, and to this day she is remembered as one of the greatest warrior leaders in history. For Nero, the revolt represented a crack in the facade of his empire, which was already fraying from other internal crises. Although he had won militarily, Boudica's revolt showed everyone that even under such a vast and powerful empire, tensions in the provinces could easily threaten the stability of Rome. The episode contributed to the growing popular and military discontent that would later turn against Nero. Seneca, one of the most respected philosophers of ancient Rome and a mentor to Nero in the early years of his reign, represented the ideal of Stoic wisdom, a man of great intellect, temperance, and virtue. He was appointed by Agrippina as Nero's tutor, with the hope that he would be able to guide the young emperor in his rise to power. In the early years of his reign, Seneca had a great influence on Nero, helping him to make more balanced decisions and adopt a more controlled philosophical stance. During this period, the Roman Empire seemed to be in good hands, and Nero's administration, under Seneca's guidance, even had a semblance of justice and moderation. However, as Nero gained more power, he began to stray from Seneca's wisdom and indulge more in his own vanity and extravagant desires. Nero's changing behavior became clear over time, and while the philosopher continued to advise him based on the principles of Stoic philosophy, Nero became increasingly unpredictable and cruel. Over time, tensions between the emperor and his mentor grew, especially when Nero began to show signs of tyranny and lack of control. Nero, seeking greater freedom for his unrestrained actions, began to alienate those who had influence over him, and Seneca was one of the first victims of this transformation. The Roman Empire under Nero was plunging into a wave of persecution, assassinations, and excesses, and the philosopher, who represented order and morality, became increasingly inconvenient for an emperor who desired a government based on pleasure and indulgence. The culmination of this rupture came in AD 65, when Seneca was accused of conspiring against Nero, partly due to the Pisan conspiracy, a plot by Roman nobles to overthrow the emperor. It is not known for certain whether Seneca actually participated in the conspiracy or was merely a victim of Nero's growing paranoia, but regardless, he was called to stand trial. The emperor, already suspicious and jealous, did not hesitate to sentence the philosopher to death. The decree was both cruel and symbolically significant. Nero, who had been educated by Seneca, now saw him as a threat. Seneca was forced to commit suicide. He was sentenced to die a slow and painful death by cutting his own veins. But after some time, when the bleeding did not result in the expected death, he asked that his veins be opened completely. In the end, after the physical suffering, Seneca died peacefully and serenely, according to reports of his last words, which reflect the wisdom and calm typical of his philosophy. Seneca's death was a tragic event that caused great commotion in Rome. He was admired for his integrity and brilliant mind, and his loss was seen as a major defeat for the empire, symbolizing the growing corruption and decadence of Nero's rule. The philosopher's death represented the point at which Nero ceased to be guided by reason and virtue, and gave into chaos and brutality. His death also exemplified how Nero was increasingly isolated in his tyranny, losing the support of the wisest and most just men in the empire. The episode of Seneca's death not only disgusted the Roman people, but also made it clear that the empire was being corrupted by the violence and paranoia of its emperor. Seneca's wisdom, which had been a moral and intellectual beacon for Nero, was now silenced, and with it Nero's Rome moved further and further away from the virtues that had sustained the empire during its early centuries. By AD 65, the Roman Empire was in a state of increasing instability, with Nero's rule marked by a series of unpopular decisions and acts of cruelty. Confidence in the emperor was crumbling, not only among the commoners and soldiers, but also within the Roman aristocracy itself. It was only a matter of time before a conspiracy was orchestrated to overthrow him. This conspiracy became known as the Pisan conspiracy, a plot led by a group of Roman nobles and senators dissatisfied with Nero's rule. The name Pisan comes from Calpurnius Pisan. One of the main people involved was an influential senator and member of one of the most powerful families in Rome. The plot was aimed at killing Nero and placing Piso on the throne. Although the plot was secret, Nero soon learned of its existence, and as expected, did not hesitate to take drastic action to ensure his survival. The plot was a reaction to Nero's growing paranoia and tyranny. He had in recent years strayed from good governance and given himself over to a life of luxury and excess. His persecution of Christians, the murder of his own mother, and the executions of prominent figures in his court had created a climate of terror in Rome. Many of the once loyal senators and members of the nobility began to realize that the empire was being ruled by a selfish, unpredictable, and immoral man. As a result, they began to plot to restore order and dignity to the empire by removing Nero from power. When the conspiracy was discovered, Nero reacted brutally. He vehemently accused the conspirators of treason, and a series of arrests and executions were quickly ordered. Piso, the leader of the conspiracy, was forced to commit suicide, along with other members of the Roman elite involved in the plot. Not content with hangings and forced suicides, Nero also executed people who were connected to the conspiracy, including some of the highest members of the Roman nobility, among them the famous philosopher Lucan, who ironically had been a critic of Nero. Pisan conspiracy episode marked yet another moment of isolation for Nero. He was already surrounded by enemies, and with the discovery of the conspiracy, he lost the trust of his last allies within the Senate and the Roman aristocracy. His rule became increasingly delegitimized, and the perception of Nero as a cruel and paranoid tyrant was cemented. Furthermore, the fact that Rome's leading senators, people who had previously been the basis of his political support, were now conspiring against him, showed how fragile his reign had become. After the suppression of the conspiracy, Nero found himself even more disconnected from reality. He was surrounded by informers and fearful subjects, and his response was to sink even deeper into extravagant and decadent behavior. The Roman Empire, which had once seemed unshakable, was now at the mercy of an emperor whose rule was marked by paranoia and instability. Pisan conspiracy was also further evidence of the growing discontent with Nero. The fact that the Roman Senate itself, once a pillar of imperial authority, was now conspiring to overthrow the emperor, reflected a dramatic transformation in the political structure of Rome. The empire was in a state of turmoil, with Nero's leadership becoming increasingly vulnerable to revolt, both internally and externally. As Nero's reign progressed, the Roman Empire, which had been a machine of conquest, prosperity, and order under previous emperors, began to crumble under the weight of Nero's inability to rule with prudence and wisdom. The empire, which had experienced some of its greatest expansion under emperors such as Augustus and Trajan, was now on the brink of collapse, not due to external enemies, but due to the increasingly erratic and destructive behavior of its own ruler. Nero's extravagant behavior and moral decline were not the only causes of the destabilization. The Roman economy was deteriorating under his management. Nero spent large sums on personal projects of luxury and ostentation, such as the construction of his Domus Aurea, a gigantic palace that extended over vast areas of the city of Rome. Meanwhile, the Roman people and legions suffered from a lack of resources and essential goods. The empire, which depended on a constant flow of resources from its provinces, saw its finances weaken, which generated growing discontent among the Roman elites and the people. Furthermore, Nero's fiscal policy was marked by inefficiency and abuse of power. Increased taxes and mismanagement of resources caused an economic imbalance that only worsened over time. While the empire was trying to sustain a military war machine that was already stretched thin on several fronts, Nero failed to provide adequate support to his legions. This lack of support for the military forces was another of Nero's great mistakes, leading to a decline in discipline and loyalty among the troops. In terms of foreign policy, the Roman Empire also began to be questioned. Although Nero initiated some campaigns of conquest, such as an attempt to expand the empire in the east, the lack of military leadership and the absence of strategic focus made these expeditions fruitless. The war in Armenia and the control over the Parthian Empire became a burden for the empire, with few significant victories. This further weakened Rome's position on the international scene, making it vulnerable to attacks from barbarian peoples on the borders. The Senate and the Roman nobility were also dissatisfied with Nero's increasing arbitrariness. The loss of confidence in his decisions and his lack of moral authority resulted in an increasingly distant relationship between the emperor and the elite. The Senate, once a powerful body, became marginalized, and its voices, often ignored, began to be raised against Nero. Nero's disregard for Roman tradition and policy was seen as an affront to the empire, which until that point had been ruled by respectful and reasonable figures. Widespread dissatisfaction culminated in a revolt in the provinces, and in 68 AD the Roman army rebelled against Nero, no longer willing to continue supporting an emperor whose leadership was crumbling. The legions of several Roman provinces turned against him, and the Senate itself eventually declared Nero a public enemy. Nero's flight without military or political support was the final point of his reign, and he committed suicide on 9 June 68 AD, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's collapse and death represented a turning point for the Roman Empire. His reign was not only a moral and political downfall, but also a warning of how a lack of control and accountability in such a vast empire could result in internal disintegration. Nero's decadence and excesses left deep scars on Rome, and his death was a prelude to a series of civil wars that would rock Rome in the years that followed, in the period known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero's reign, which began with promises of renewal and stability for the Roman Empire, ended in a total collapse of his authority. In the last years of his rule, Nero was widely discredited by the Roman elite tier, military leaders and the people themselves, who now saw him no longer as a legitimate ruler, but as an uncontrolled tyrant. Nero's reputation, which had already been tarnished by his extravagant public displays and the brutality with which he treated his enemies, was finally destroyed when the Senate, in a decisive act, declared him an enemy of the people. The Roman Senate, once a powerful and respected institution, had lost much of its influence during Nero's reign. However, even the senators most loyal to the emperor began to see that his lack of political control and ruthlessness were destroying Rome's foundations. The moral and political decline that marked his rule had brought the empire to the brink of disintegration, and faced with growing rebellion in the provinces and a loss of military support, the Senate had no choice but to act. In AD 68, Nero became the target of a final plot that spread throughout the Roman legions. Roman soldiers, who had once been loyal to Nero, were now turning against him, tired of his irresponsible governance and excessive spending on personal luxuries, while the empire faced serious economic difficulties. However, the most profound blow came from the Senate itself, which, in a historic and symbolic move, declared Nero an enemy of the state, stripping him of his imperial power. The word enemy of the people not only sealed his fate as emperor, but also signified the complete loss of legitimacy. He was no longer seen as the leader of Rome, but as a threat to the stability of the empire. The declaration of enemy of the people was more than just a title. It was an official acknowledgement that the empire was being undermined by its tyranny and that the only way to restore order was to eliminate Nero. The fact that the very Senate, which had once supported him, had now turned against him, was irrefutable proof that the Roman Empire was no longer in the hands of a strong and respected ruler, but of a solitary and paranoid tyrant. Without the support of the Senate, the nobility, and the troops, Nero found himself completely isolated. The revolt of the legions in the provinces, especially in Gaul, became irreversible. And even so, Nero tried to escape the situation, asking for the support of his last allies, who soon withdrew. Seeing that his authority had been completely undermined, Nero fled the city, with few by his side. His steps were being followed by those who had previously applauded him, and Nero's downfall seemed to be only a matter of time. The decline of his rule was marked by his shameful flight, and ultimately his suicide on June 9, 68 AD. Nero, surrounded by the forces of the army he himself had commanded, chose to die rather than be captured. His death put an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty and ushered in a period of instability in the empire known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero was not only the harbinger of his own destruction, but also a historical warning. His rise to the throne was marked by manipulation and ambition, but his reign became an example of how abuse of power, cruelty, and moral decay can lead to the collapse of a nation. From that point on, Rome began to rebuild itself, and subsequent emperors sought to restore the dignity of the empire, with a leadership more focused on political stability and the well-being of the people. The declaration of enemy of the people was, in a way, the final fatal blow to Nero, demonstrating how deeply he had strayed from the virtues that Rome had once represented. His death, while symbolic of the end of his dynasty, also marked the turning point of a new chapter, in which the Roman Empire would seek to recover from its excesses and internal decay. Having been declared an enemy of the people, and having lost the support of the legions and the Senate, Nero found himself completely isolated and without options. The Roman Empire, which he had ruled with a mixture of luxury, cruelty, and eccentricity, was now in disarray. Revolts in the provinces, growing dissatisfaction with his leadership, and the support of his own advisors and governors were rapidly disintegrating. As the forces of the Roman army turned against him, Nero knew that his downfall was imminent. With the rebels hot on his trail, Nero fled Rome in an act of desperation. He retreated to one of his palaces outside the city, the Domus Transitoria, and trying desperately to avoid capture, he sought support among the few allies he still had left. But most of those around him had already turned away, and the Roman senators and generals, who had previously been loyal, were now completely against him. The empire, which he had once ruled with great pomp, now seemed to be disintegrating around him. The situation became more serious when Roman soldiers began to advance towards him. Fearing that he would be captured and likely executed in a humiliating manner, Nero decided to commit suicide, a choice that reflected his despair. The thought of being tried for his crimes and humiliated in public was unbearable to him, and he retreated to his palace, where he ordered his servants to prepare his death. The scene of Nero's death, as described by Roman historians, is one of the most tragic and symbolic moments in Roman history. Nero tried to kill himself with the help of a servant, but due to his nervousness and weakness, he failed several times. It was then that one of his loyal advisors named Epaphroditus helped him cut his wrists. The emperor, without the strength to resist, succumbed to loss of blood, thus closing the cycle of one of the most controversial figures in Roman history. Nero's suicide on June 968 AD was not only the end of his life, but also the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for over a century. Nero's death sealed the fate of the empire, and a period of chaos and civil war followed, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. During this period, the empire was rocked by struggles for the throne between various generals and pretenders, with no strong leadership to restore stability. Nero, who had begun his reign with such promise, was now just a tragic memory of an empire in decline. Throughout his reign, Nero was both adored and hated. His early actions as emperor were seen as promising, but his relentless pursuit of power and fame, coupled with his tyrannical and excessive attitudes, eventually led to his downfall. The empire, which had been sustained by figures such as Augustus and Trajan, now lay in ruins, and Nero was a reflection of how absolute power, left unchecked, could destroy even the most imposing of empires. His suicide, though marked by despair, also symbolized the end of an era for Rome. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had begun with the rise of Julius Caesar and established itself under Augustus, had ended in tragic and humiliating fashion under Nero. Its end was not only a reflection of his personal downfall, but also a sign that the Roman Empire, under his leadership, had lost its way. Rather than continuing Rome's legacy, Nero became the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and his death ushered in a new era of instability and change in the empire. Nero's legacy is one of the most controversial and debated in the history of Rome. On the one hand, he was an emperor who ruled a vast empire, full of wealth and power. On the other, he was also a tyrannical ruler, marked by extravagance, cruelty, and erratic decisions that led Rome to a series of political and social crises. Nero's name, therefore, carries with it both the grandeur of a powerful Rome and the traces of a Rome in decline, consumed by its own decadence. Early in his reign, Nero seemed to have the potential to be a great emperor. He began by ruling under the guidance of figures such as Seneca and other wise advisors, which allowed him to get off to a relatively promising start. During his early years in power, Nero even seemed concerned with the well-being of his people and the governance of the empire, focusing on reforms that eased taxes and encouraged the construction of public works. He also showed sensitivity to the needs of the lower classes, something rare for an emperor of his time. However, this image of a benevolent ruler quickly faded as power went to Nero's head. Over the course of his reign, he became more extravagant and volatile, disregarding the advice of figures such as Seneca and beginning to make decisions based on his own personal desires, such as his obsession with being seen as an artist. His desire for fame and recognition led him to abandon the responsibilities of governing in favor of a life of luxury, banquets, and public performances, in which he performed as a singer, actor, and poet. To the Romans, this was an affront to imperial authority, and Nero came to be seen as an emperor more concerned with gaining applause than with keeping the empire strong and united. As his eccentric and irresponsible behavior increased, so did his political corruption. Nero began to surround himself with subjects more loyal to himself than to the empire, often executing those who challenged him or were considered a threat. The famous execution of his mother, Agrippina, was an early sign of his cruelty and willingness to eliminate anyone who might interfere with his rule. He also murdered his wife, Octavia, and executed important figures in his court, such as the philosopher Seneca, who had once been his mentor. Furthermore, the widespread persecution of Christians during his reign, particularly after the burning of Rome, became one of the darkest legacies of his empire. The way he scapegoated Christians, brutally torturing and killing many, marks one of the first significant episodes of religious persecution in history. Although the consequences of his religious actions were not immediate, their impact reverberated throughout the centuries, as Christians began to spread further into Rome and eventually throughout the empire. Despite the repression, The Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 was another defining event that affected Nero's legacy. Suspicions that he started the fire to make room for his luxurious palace, the Domus Aurea, associated his name with destruction and decay. Although he tried to rebuild the city and help those affected, the accusations of negligence and even direct involvement in the fire were never forgotten. Instead of being seen as a strong leader who restored Rome, he became the symbol of a weak and self-centered emperor, incapable of dealing with a crisis of great magnitude. As his leadership began to crumble, Nero was finally deposed in a military coup and committed suicide in AD 68, after being declared an enemy of the people and losing the support of the Roman elite. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for over a century and opened a period of instability in the empire, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Today, Nero's legacy is a powerful reminder of how abuse of power and a lack of accountability by a ruler can destroy even the greatest empires. He is remembered as an eccentric and cruel emperor whose actions led to the weakening of the empire's structures, creating a vacuum of authority that would result in civil war and instability for Rome. His name has become synonymous with decadence and despotism, and he remains a historical figure who stirs debate to this day. Despite its tragedies and excesses, Nero's reign can also be seen as a warning about the dangers of absolute power and lack of limits in government, showing how an empire can be destroyed from within by a leader who loses touch with reality. The figure of Nero, who ruled Rome during the 1st century, remains one of the most controversial and fascinating in the history of the Roman Empire. His name is often associated with decadence, cruelty, and tyranny, but over the centuries the perception of Nero has been shaped in different ways, reflecting the interests and views of different eras. During his lifetime, Nero was widely regarded as an overly self-centered, weak, and irresponsible emperor. He began his reign with the potential to be an effective ruler, but his rise to power was marked by family intrigue and manipulation, with his mother, Agrippina, exerting great influence over him. In the early years of his reign, under the tutelage of Seneca, Nero appeared to pursue a policy of moderation and justice, until his behavior began to change to the opposite. He indulged in luxury, excessive banqueting, and public spectacle, marking a growing distance from Roman traditions. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD was a turning point for Nero. The suspicion that he had deliberately started the fire to build his luxurious Domus Aurea cemented his image as an emperor indifferent to the suffering of the people. The accusation that Nero played his lyre while Rome burned became one of the most enduring and contemptuous images in Roman memory. The fire and its aftermath, including the brutal persecution of Christians, only intensified the negative perception of his rule. However, after his death and the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero came to be interpreted in different ways by historians over the centuries. In the first centuries after his death, Nero was remembered primarily as a villain. The Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius, who wrote about Nero's reign, portrayed him in an extremely negative light, accusing him of crimes such as the murder of his mother, the murder of his wife and his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the persecution of Christians. These sources formed the basis of what became known as the Black History of Nero, making him a symbol of excess and corruption. The image of Nero as an uncontrolled and cruel emperor persisted throughout the Middle Ages and was reinforced by Christianity. Nero was associated with the Antichrist in many Christian depictions and was seen as a symbol of destruction and oppression, especially due to his persecution of Christians. This stigma persisted for centuries, cementing the view of Nero as a demonized tyrant. However, as modern historiography developed, especially from the 19th century onwards, scholars began to question the one-sidedness of Nero's portrayal. Some historians began to re-evaluate his reign and challenge traditional narratives. For example, there are those who argue that part of Nero's negative image was a political construct, orchestrated by his enemies and the Roman elites, who overthrew him. They suggest that he did in fact attempt to implement economic and political reforms, and that although his decisions were often wrong, he was not an outright villain, but a ruler surrounded by opposing and adverse forces. In more recent times, some analyses have suggested that Nero was the victim of negative propaganda, used by his opponents to justify his downfall and consolidate the power of his successors. The idea that Nero genuinely cared about the arts and culture, and that he may have been an emperor with a more open vision for the artistic world, is beginning to gain more traction. This perspective revives the idea that he had a dynamic and innovative vision, which was stifled by his political mistakes and lack of self-control. Furthermore, in modern times, Nero's figure has begun to be seen in a different light, particularly in leadership studies. He is often cited as an example of how abuse of power and lack of strategic vision can lead to the collapse of an empire. Nero's fall, marked by paranoia, excess, and brutality, has become a classic study of the dangers of unchecked power, showing how a ruler can lose the support of both his court and the people when he strays from the fundamental values of stable and just government. In terms of popular culture, Nero continues to be a character of great appeal, being portrayed in books, films, and plays as the mad and cruel emperor, but also as a fascinating and tragic figure whose reign was a mixture of greatness and misfortune. His story inspires reflection on the risks of absolute power and the dangers that excessive indulgence can bring to any nation. Nero's death on June 9, 68 AD was not only the end of an era of excess and decadence in the Roman Empire, but also the beginning of a period of great instability. The Roman Empire, which had been ruled by the Julio-Claudian dynasty for more than a century, now found itself adrift, without a clear leader and without the necessary structure to deal with the internal and external challenges that were emerging. After Nero's death, the Roman Empire was plunged into a succession crisis, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, 69 AD, when four leaders vied for control of Rome. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for the throne, resulting in a series of civil wars, destruction, and political uncertainty. The collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty left a power vacuum that the Roman Empire could not immediately fill, and this weakened the authority of the central government. The Roman Senate, which had declared Nero an enemy of the people, now found itself in the position of attempting to restore order in Rome. However, its authority had been eroded by the death of the emperor, and the Senate found it difficult to impose any control over the armies loyal to the various claimants to the throne. Rather than seeking a strong, unifying leader, the Roman nobility was consumed by ambition and internal division, which led to a series of failed attempts to stabilize the situation. The fragility of the empire's borders was also exposed. During the reign of Nero, many of Rome's borders were being strained by barbarian invasions, and the lack of a stable government meant that the invading peoples began to challenge Rome's power. The Roman army, traditionally one of the greatest military forces in antiquity, was divided and disorganized, and the lack of internal cohesion meant that the barbarians seized the opportunity to attack Rome's borders more aggressively. Internally, Nero's death also had profound effects on the Roman economy. Political instability led to an economic crisis, with a decline in agricultural production and trade, which were the pillars of the Roman economy. The loss of a strong leader like Nero resulted in a lack of trust among both wealthy landowners and merchants and artisans, creating a scenario of increasing poverty and inequality. Furthermore, Nero's public image as a tyrannical and irresponsible emperor had a profound impact on Roman morale. During his reign, the lack of respect for Rome's traditional institutions and values had created a crisis of legitimacy and a breakdown in the empire's social fabric. Nero's moral and political downfall was seen as a reflection of how the Roman Empire was moving away from its republican roots and its old system of government, based on a balance of power between the Senate, the people, and the emperor. On the other hand, Nero's death also represented the end of a dynasty that, despite its initial greatness, had been marked by decadence and corruption. The transition of power opened the door to a new Flavian dynasty, with Vespasian ascending the throne and restoring some order to the empire. Vespasian was a more pragmatic leader and focused on the needs of the empire, in contrast to Nero's fickle and self-centered behavior. Still, Nero's death was a cataclysmic event for Rome, showing how such a vast and powerful empire could be destabilized by an unstable and unpopular leader. The transition to a new dynasty and the search for stability did not come without pain, and Nero's legacy as a corrupt and ineffective emperor endured for centuries. Did you like this video? Like, comment, and share with your friends.